Shalom Aleichem. Let's learn a Sikha. It's a Rashi Sikha Vayeishev Aleph based on Sikhas the Rebbe said on Shabbos Parshas Vayeishev and the fifth night of Chanukah Tavshin Lamed towards the end of 1969. It's at the beginning of the Parsha. It's a Rashi Sikha that Yosef is sharing his dreams with his brothers, and it says he's had another dream. He told his brothers, and they hated him even more. This is the first dream, and they hated him more after the fact that he already received the Ksenes Pasim from his father. And he says, listen to the dream I've dreamed. V'hinei, and behold, anachnu ma'almim alumim, we are gathering sheaves, b'seich hasadeh, in the midst of the field. V'hinei kama lumasi v'gam nitzava, when suddenly my sheep stands up and remains upright. V'hinei sesubena lumoiseichem vatishtachaven la lumasi. And your sheep formed a circle around my sheep and prostrated, bow down in front of me. Comes Rashi on Ma'almim Alumim and says Targum, like the Targum says. What does the Targum say? Anachna ma'asrin asaron. We are ma'asrin asaron. We're binding binds. And then Rashi says amarin. Amarin is sheaves. And the proof is, he brings a proof from the Pasuk in Tehillim that Hashem is carrying, that Noisel Moisel is carrying the bundles. And also it's found, the Lashon Mishnah, the expression of the Mishnah, Baba Metzia, the Alumais, and when somebody finds sheaves, he takes them and announces them so that whoever is there can go find them. Comes Rashi and comes the Rebbe and says, what's Rashi coming to tell us? So simply, we never learned what Ma'almim Alumim means, and therefore Rashi is bringing from the Targum. And then Rashi is adding to explain that Alumim means Amnin. Because you would, that in order to tell you that Ma'almim Alumim means that you bind sheep. Says the Rebbe like this. First of all, you could have just said Targum like the Rashi does often. Now, if he wants to explain Alumim separately, then he should have done a separate Rashi. How does Alumim, the fact that it's Amrin, enter this Rashi? And why is Rashi bringing two rayas, especially that the second one is it's not from Tanakh, it's from a Mishnah. Now, why when he brings the raya from the Pasuk in Tehillim does he say Noisei Alumoisa? He doesn't just say Alumoisa, which tells us what it is. So too, when it brings the raya from the Mishnah, why does he have to say Neitu Amachris? He could have just said Alumus. Comes to them and says, after asking these 5 questions, that Rashi is not here to tell us mainly that Ma'almim Alumim means that they bind binds, but rather that Alumim means sheaves. What does that mean? Yosef's dream is similar to what we say regarding Paro's dream, that Hashem, what he intends on doing, says it in a dream. So when Yosef is saying his dream, everything about the dream is intentional. The details as well, because the dream is not just, oh, by the way, I want to share with you a dream. This is how reality is going to play out. Comes Rashi and says that the fact that they were alumim, the fact that they were sheaves, was also intentional. And it fits to the event that's going to play out eventually. What happened eventually? In Parshas Miketz, they need grain, and they come to Yosef to get grain. So the ideas of the dream, the fact that they were grain, is very intentional. Says the Rebbe in the Ara 11, even though we know that not every dream, Rashi says in our parsha, a few psukim from now, every dream has Dvarim B'Telem. So how can you say everything's intentional? He says Dvarim B'Telem means that they're not going to happen, not that they're not intentional. For example, what did Rashi refer to? The fact that Rachel Imenu will never bow down to, she symbolized the star, the stars in the second dream. She didn't bow down. Yes, but the fact is that conceptually there was the idea of everyone bowing down, even though if it didn't play out, especially that there was Bilha who did bow down. So the dreams not necessarily will play out in every detail, but every detail is intentional. There's a meaning there. So therefore we can understand why Rashi has to introduce first what Amim Malumim means, Ma'asrin Asrin. Because there's a different Targum. There's not only Targum, includes this Targum Yerushalmi. And Targum Yerushalmi uses a different Targum. He says, Mekarchen Klichan. which can mean either binding or sandwiching, like when you do koyrech at a Pesach Seder. Now, according to Rashi, who says that it was sheaves, you must mean that they were bound, that they were tied rather than piled on, because the whole point is that when you have sheaves, you bind them together so that they don't fly around. If you just pile them on, they're going to fly. So therefore, Rashi has to say which Targum he's referring to, Onkelos, because he's not referring to Targum Yerushalmi. So therefore, he has to be very intentional in what Targum he's referring to. Now, how does he know why does he follow Targum Onkelos rather than Yerushalmi? Because in his interpretation, Alumim is Amrin. And therefore, because it's Amrin, it must mean that Ma'almin is Karchin rather than Kshira rather than Karchin. Says the Rebbe, but according to the Targum, who said Onkelos, who says Ma'asrin, it's obvious that you bind. The Almim Alumim is binding binds. They're the same word. So even if you're going to say that there was sheaves, it should be hinted in the word alumim. Alumim simply means binding binds. It's the verb and the noun. And therefore Rashi says, no, I'll show you that alumim doesn't only mean binds, even though it's the same word as ma'almim. I'll show you proofs that ma'almim could mean amrim. And therefore, what does he have to do? When he brings the pasuk on Tilim, he says, noisei alamoisav. Because over here, from the fact that it says noisei, and then it's alamoisav, you can't carry knots. What does that mean? I'm carrying binds. Therefore, you see, that means amrin, it means sheaves. And Rashi is not sufficing with this example, because you could fetch and say that he's talking about bags which are tied, not that the alumais themselves are amrin. So therefore, Rashi brings another raya from the Mishnah, that alumais, when you find them, because they're so heavy, you can't schlep them, and they can't be rolled. So therefore, you just take and announce, this is where I found it, Makaiman have a simon, the place where you found it is a simon. So from the fact that you say that they could not be carried, means that it's amrin, which are sheaves, which don't roll well. And especially that we know that in Mishnah, it's even more specific, because it's halacha than Torah. In other words, obviously Torah, everything's specific, but it could be multiple meanings. In halacha, there's no multiple meanings. It's straightforward. However, you could have said that lashon Torah la'atzma, lashon chacham la'atzma, and therefore you can't learn from chacham to Torah. So therefore, Rashi first prioritizes the proof of the Tehillim. That is the pshat element in the Sikha. Comes to them and says, Miyena shal Torah b'pirush Rashi. Torah, it explains that what does ma'almim alumim mean? It means to elevate the sparks that separated when there was shviras hakelim from toyim, and we have to elevate them. Well, what do? We elevate them to go back into Atzilus, specifically Malchus Atzilus, the lowest element with Atzilus, which comes into Bria. We elevate it to there. Just like ma'almim alumim is that you bind sheaves, you bring them together. So too, you bring the sparks back together. Now, this idea of bira nitzotzes is also found within the neshamas. In other words, each and every one of us within our neshama to bring it back, not only the world, but inside ourselves. So ma'almim alumim, where does that usually happen? It happens in a sada. You have to go out to the sada to reach out to get the ma'almim alumim. What's the hida? The hida is that besides the fact that a person has to gather the sparks by themselves, but they have to go more so, they have to go into the sada to gather the sparks, and that is by dealing with others in chutzah, to bring them to tshuva, to bring them closer to Avodas Hashem, to Torah, to Chassidus, the Marshaba, the tree of life. And that is what Rabbi Vayeishev started sending shluchim. That was their custom, to places even far. Says the Rebbe Na'ara, even though they're far distant, they're not far spiritually because they're close to the Meshaleach. The person who's there is close to the Meshaleach. As we said in the previous Sikha, that even when you're in Chutzah, you're still nevertheless connected to the Meshaleach. And to spread over there, Chassidus. Now, comes to them and says, so Rashi's coming and telling us, Ma'amim Malumim means Ma'asrin Asrin. What is he teaching us? That you have to bind, you have to make things mekusher. And as the Rebbe says, Na'ara, from Mekuti Yavitzach, it has to be a kesher b'chayzik, it has to be strong. A strong kesher shel kayama. You have to make sure that the person that you're influencing becomes mekusher, stronger to Avodas Hashem in a way that the Ruach Shtus, whatever winds there are, will never take the person and make them deviate from their path. How do you do it? By Amnin. You do it by a kesher shel shibalim. What's shibalim? Grain. Things that grow and grow and grow. In other words, turn the other person to mashpia. Turn the other person to a thing of being who makes prayers. Make another mashpia, and that will make sure that the avodah will last. And after that, the pasuk says, "Vatishtachavenu la'alumasi," and what's the final avodah? That you bring all the alumas and they bow down to la'alumasi, to my original one. In other words, to my Rebbe who sent me out to the Nasi Adar, to Yosef Atzadik. Now we know that Shabbos is connected to the days of the week before and the days of the week after. And very often, Parshas Vayeishev falls on the Shabbos between Yud Kislev and Chanukah. This year falls on Yud Kislev and the Shabbos before Chanukah. And because we know that the Shabbosim are connected to the days of the week that fall through, the Rebbe that fall in that week, as the Rebbe references the Shalah, who he brings often. So what's the connection? Says the Rebbe like this: the idea of Ma'alim Alumim is a similar concept that Yud Kislev and Chanukah share. What's one of the minyanim ha'ikrim, one of the fundamental things that the Alter Rebbe kept himself busy was making Bali Tshuva. The famous thing that he told his son, the Mittel Rebbe, regarding a famous dream he had, that he heard from the Magid, the mashal regarding tzaddikim and Bali Tshuva. In other words, that the person who deals with Bali Tshuva is in a much higher level, and that engraved in him that he has to go be makar many Yidden to Yiddishkeit. And the Shanim, for 5 years, he traveled from place to place, both public and private, to awakening to Kedusha. And after Yud Kislev, that was Atchalas Hafatzas Mayanis, Yafutzah Mayanis with incredible way, reaching to every single person in a way that they could understand. And Chanukah is Laniach Pesach B'Bachutz. You have to put it outside. You have to brighten up the world. Again, elevate the world, elevate the sparks. And through this avodah of bringing the sparks, that is what accomplishes that everyone does tshuva, and through tshuva miyad hinigalim, b'gulam b'dis vashlema, takef umiyad mamish